All right, all right. So let me introduce myself. My name's Leon Lincoln. I work for a company called VF. I'm sure nobody's actually ever heard of that. Why am I feedbacking? I'm good, okay. All right. So what is VF? Well, most of you have probably never heard of it, and nor should you. So VF is a company that actually owns a bunch of footwear and apparel companies. So if you've heard of Vans, heard of the North Face, Timberland, Dickies, those are all companies that I do work for. Right? I am actually an engineer for VF. I actually work on taking their design environment and their designers, their product creators, and I help them transition from a 2D dimensional workflow to a 3D dimensional workflow. All right, so this is kind of the cool stuff I get to do. But I've been in the business for a long time. I did 12 years at MIT, working for the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Prior to that, I worked for the New England Journal of Medicine, the Mass Medical Society, which is, if you know for the New England Journal of Medicine, is going to be a problem for me? Okay. Is they publish the Journal of Fact for doctors, right? So I started in the IT world before there was such thing as IT. That's how far back I go. I've been working with every macOS since 1984. When I was out in LA living at the time, we got the first Macintosh. We looked at it and went, oh, we're so screwed. We're so far behind on our research and development because I was working in the printing industry. And we saw the potential. And by 1986, I knew that my job was gone because I looked at what they could produce with a Aldus PageMaker, not Adobe, Aldus PageMaker. When I looked at what they could produce for $9 compared to what I was charging about $100 for, I went, my job's history, right? So I've actually, at that point, decided I needed to learn a bunch of new things. And I was working with computers long before a lot of people were because they were part of my production environment, right? So, I've been around for a while. I work with a lot of cool stuff. Neil will often come in and inject, what's the biggest amount of storage you've ever worked for? I bet you I beat it. All right? When I was at MIT, I managed 30 petabytes. Locally, 12 to 15 in the cloud. If you don't know what a petabyte is, come see me afterwards. I'll give you a breakdown what that is. All right? So I have some chops. I've got some background, right? But what makes me really excited about working inside this conference and all the other things I do with Neil is the fact that I get a chance to interact with you guys. Right? I work as a engineer inside a big corporation. I don't deal with the little guy very much. Right? When I talk to the little guy, I mean the small shops. Right? My projects are all multi-million-dollar. I don't, for me to deploy a piece of hardware, it's like, yeah, it's a major deal. Like last week I was in Switzerland, right, doing a bunch of deployments for over there. So, kind of give you an idea for the scope and stuff I deal with. But one of the things that I do inside of VF is I actually look at and I live in the betas for Mac. So I am both a Windows administrator, a Linux administrator, a Mac architect, right? So I've got that foundation. So I've been living in Catalina for a long time now. And I just want you to see a couple things because we're going to talk about the impact on security, right? For the enterprise. Some of the changes inside the operating system. For some of you, you're going to go, I already know this stuff. Great. Right? Some of you may not realize it. And I just want you to be really comfortable with this information. All right? So this is what we're going to talk a little bit about. We're going to look at kext. We're going to look at volume changes. We're going to talk about enhancements to Gatekeeper. We're going to look at notarization. We're going to look at transparency, consent, and control, otherwise known as TCC. Right? We're going to look at activation lock and why that's important, and we'll talk a little bit about Safari, and I'll throw a couple of smidgen of other things in there. I just didn't want to create another series of slides for, but we'll get there. All right? So what's really important to recognize is kernel extensions. What are they? Who can give me a definition of what a kernel extension is? Sure.
It's an additional piece of language that helps an app communicate directly with the kernel.
So kernel extensions are basically code that's written for a low-level access to the hardware, right? So when you have your keyboard attached, there's a kernel extension that addresses that need. When you have a mouse, same thing. You have a printer. It needs a kernel extension to actually talk to that. So there are lots of little things that the kernel extensions have been doing for a long time, and Apple writes a lot of those. There are third-party vendors, like, when you get into the graphics cards, they write kernel extensions and they drop them in. What's their counterpart of that on the Windows platform? I can't hear if you say it, so you got to be bold. Device drivers, which are also called DLLs, right? So, we have kernel extensions, DLLs, same thing, right? But how they work may be acting a little differently, and it's important to recognize that. Now, Apple, for a long time, with kernel extensions, have been saying, this is inside the operating system, it's a low-level functionality, so if I payload in a kernel extension, what happens, right? It immediately starts addressing the hardware that I want it to do. But that changes with Catalina, right? And we'll talk why, right? What they're all becoming into is its system extensions. So the kernel extensions still exist. So if you opened up Catalina and you looked at it and said, no, the kexts are there. That's true, they are there. But they're going to start being treated like system extensions. And you'll see why when we talk about how the system volumes have changed. But it's important to recognize that these tools that we use, all the rules are changing. And if you ever looked at a kernel extension, you would see it. You could actually see the code if you could break into it a little bit. Right? So here's an example of what kernel extensions. Oh, that's beautiful. It's totally. Can you guys see, or is it all blown away? Right? All right. Okay. So kernel extensions, they look like building blocks, right? Like Lego building blocks. And if you actually did a right click on them, you could see show the package contents, and you would see their resources. They're built, right? Now they live in a couple locations on the computer, right? And if we look here, we'll see that we have them in system, right? So we look and we'll see that, they're in syslibrary extensions, and then there's library extensions. This is important. Why? Well, because certain levels of these things are locked down even more, right? So, the operating system is, as we're going to show you in a couple seconds, is locked completely. And let me go and show you what I'm talking about, right? So, Catalina runs as a read-only system. That's a major change. Let's really grasp that for a second. How many here have ever worked with Google Chromebooks? Right? Great product. What makes them really successful? Right? Because I used to deploy them in education. If I deployed a Chromebook and the kid hacked the hell out of it, right? As soon as I rebooted it, what happened? It's back to where it was, right? It was completely locked. So it said, you can do whatever you want to this thing, but the second we reboot it, it's back to its baseline, right? This is the same concept we're going to start seeing with the macOS, saying that if anything tries to compromise the operating system at a low level, it's not going to find a foothold because it's not going to be allowed, right? So when we look at it and say macOS is really running in a locked volume, it's really interesting. And if you've never seen this because you haven't run Catalina yet, when you go in and you look at it and say, all right, so here's my hard drive, here's the container, and there are two slices inside of it, and they're both called Macintosh hard drive. You're going, how does that work? Right? One's notified, it says it's data, the other one's just Macintosh hard drive. Well, what's interesting is the Macintosh hard drive is only 10.83 gigabytes in size. That's the operating system, and it is read-only. Everything else lives in data. Now, how does that impact us for an enterprise? Hugely, because if you've got stuff written for, let's say, customization that you're payloading things in, where do those files really live now? Because you may think they lived in, say, just /applications, and you may find out that's not true anymore, right? And if it does live in slash applications, is it read-writable? Can you make changes there? Or is it you have to go to another location, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. But see, having the system being locked down prevents malicious code from being infected or damaging the operating system. And that's a real important function. So in the past, when you examined your drive, you could see everything was in users slash in your name, right? Or the client's name. Now you're going to find that everything lives under system, volumes, data, users. That's important change, right? So if you're writing a script and you want to make sure you're putting something in, you have to make sure you know exactly where it lives. Now, Apple does a little bit of magic here, and I'll call that magic for the simple reason they're using symbolic links, right? So they're making, I can still go to certain locations by the old path and it'll get there. It's because I read it as a symbolic link. But when I'm scripting, I can't get away with that. I have to know exactly where something lives. I have to call it out. So if you look here, notice here on this is from Discutil in the terminal, and you see that when I ask for give me a list, it gives me this disk, and I get hard drive, I've got pre-boot, recovery, VM, and then there's a Macintosh hard drive. Now notice seems to be out of order. It doesn't care. It knows what order it should boot into. Right? All of this is important, and if you can see there, you'll see that, again, this volume is a little over 10 gigs. Right? This volume is 228 gigs. Right? So we're seeing this real modification of behavior for the operating system, and it's really going to impact us when we try to do anything special to it. All right. So what we need to really understand is we need to know where our resources really live. That's so important. Now, for MDM, where do the templates live for the user's account? Right? Because if you're payloading in changes to the template, right, which I used to do on a regular basis for all my different environments, I would customize the template for them. So when they opened it up and they logged in, it presented what I wanted them to see. But where does that really live now? So system library user template really live in library user template now. So it's, you got to really understand where all these things are, because the templates aren't read-writable if they're in the wrong location. You have to have them in a read-write location. Now, Apple's own applications, where do they live? Right? Traditionally, where do Apple's applications live? Where does the application folder live? /applications, right? It still does. But Apple's own applications do not live there. They show up there, but they do not live there. They actually live in another location, and that is system applications. Now, why is that important? Because it's read-only. So if I'm trying to make a modification to a package that's in system applications, I can't. Now, what's one of the exceptions to that rule? Safari. Why is Safari in user applications there that level as opposed to system applications? Because Safari is installable by a user and it's updated all the time. So we can't be shutting down the system to boot into a special environment just so it's Safari. Nobody would tolerate it. Think about that, right? If you told your users, oh, you're getting a Safari update and you got to reboot. Yeah, right. Not going to happen. I'll use Chrome, right? All right. So we need to really be careful in understanding that. So this is, again, terminal, and you'll see system applications, there's all the apps that Apple wrote, and it's there. That's locked. This one down here is from the user's level, and you can see I've got Adobe loaded, I've got Microsoft loaded, and there's Safari, right? So this is read-writable. So, in the old days, when I had an app that had to be, locked down specifically to a user, where would it load it? It would load it under the user's /application. It would only be for that user. This is for all users on the machine, right? So you still have that third option available to you if an app is just for that individual user, but you might find that actually you want to put it up a layer. Now, let's talk a little bit about Gatekeeper. How many people actually play with a Gatekeeper at all? Okay. So it's not for the faint of heart, I'll be honest with you, right? You can really mess up your system if you play with Gatekeeper and try to create your own rules. You really got to understand the syntax and what you're doing. Because if you actually went through the terminal commands and ran out and you said, give me what's in Gatekeeper, and you change the rules, you could create a situation where things won't run. Right? But notice here, I wanted you to see, is that allow apps downloaded from, and there are two choices only. That's on purpose, right? It's apps and App Store and apps identified by developers in App Store. Now, in the previous generation, if you look on to the right there, you would see always or anywhere, right? That was what we started with. So when they first introduced Gatekeeper, they put that there because nobody had Gatekeeper functionality added to their apps. Now we do. Can you still do from anywhere? You can, but it's only through terminal. Nor should you, though, right? So if you're still running an app that is not following the guidelines for Gatekeeper, it's probably a 32-bit app to begin with, and it isn't going to run in Catalina anyway, right? So we want to make sure that we understand that we look at what Gatekeeper is really doing for us. Now, Apple looks and uses Gatekeeper as to scan the files. So when you go to launch an app, it scans it and it says, is it identified? Does it have malicious code in it? That's part of what Gatekeeper does. It looks at it and says, is this app known as a problem on the system? So when Apple looks at it and says, you know what? There's been a compromise to Flash. They'll send an update out that tells Gatekeeper, if they try to launch Flash and it's been compromised, give them a warning and don't let it run. All right? So this is really important, and you can see here, here's all the terminal commands we can use for Gatekeeper. All right? For those of you actually running it, you can actually run spctl, right? You can actually just say -- status, and on your own machines, it'll tell you, is it enabled? And if you ask it to list out, it'll give you all the rules that are there, right? I don't want to dive into actually making changes to that in this setting. You can do it, and there may be times when it's appropriate, but let's just say that the idea is this is going to be enhanced, and we're talking about something that Apple's looking at as a way of creating layers of protection on your computer. Because that's the name of the game for security. When you look at security on your computer, it's all about layering. If it's just one thing, all I got to do is get by one thing. If it's a series of layers that I got to bypass, right, to intrude on the machine, I'm more likely to catch it as I go through each layer, step by step by step. That's why it makes the Mac more secure for a lot of environments, is because in a Windows world, and it's gotten much better, I'll give them a lot of credit. They've come a long way in the last 10 years from where it was, right? But if you look at the malware and the viruses and everything that still exists for Windows compared to the Mac, hands down, we're a more secure system. But hear me clearly, we are not immune. If you think that you run a Mac and you're safe, get your head out of the sand. That's not a true statement, because social engineering is the name of the game. If I can convince you to do something to your machine and you've got admin rights, you've done what I wanted. All right? So we need tools that look at it and say, you know what, this piece of code you're trying to execute has been played with. We need to know that. Right? So these are important tools that we look at. And so when we look at it and say, you know what, Gatekeeper is there, but what does it really do on a regular basis for us? So when we first launch it, it goes through and scans it. Does it scan it every time? That's a question that we need to look at and find out for ourselves. Right? I'm not going to give you that answer. I'm going to tell you that's your challenge to find out. Is this product doing what you think it does? or is it doing something else? Is it doing a scan on a regular basis? Is it being updated to reflect changes? All right, I can tell you that that does occur, right? There are updates that are sent to it, but you need to fully be aware of. If you modify an app, does Gatekeeper notice it? All right. Notarization, what is it? So notarization is a service developed by Apple. And forgive me, I'm going to give you the blurb, right? That we all, because it really gets to the point. It's by Apple, and it tells you that the developer ID, right? So those of us who are in the developer program, we all have developer IDs, right? And you signed a piece of software that you wrote, or you modified, or you did something to. You signed it. And when you distribute it, that is notarized by the new standards. And I'll show you the command you're going to use for that. What it does is it really makes it so it's traceable back to you. It validates you. It's another layer. Now, the real problem with notarization is it's a new frontier for everybody. And Apple's got a lot of pushback from the developer community because they feel like, you know what, you're punishing us and we're not the problem, right? It's the old analogy, you know, you make me jump through all the hoops, but the people who are bad don't. So all you're doing is punishing the good guys, right? Well, that's not true, right? I know why you feel like that, but it's again, it's about layering the protection. We need to know exactly what is happening on that app. We need to be able to look at that app and say it's been modified. And when it was modified, by who? Is it known? Is it become a problem? Right? So when you first use this, it installs and runs the software, and it creates a ticket that actually looks at and sends it to Gatekeeper and says, is there anything that I should be aware of with this? No? Oh, okay. Good, let it go. If it does, it gets involved and it says, you know what, don't run this. It's not trusted. The downside of that is it's not that hard to spoof right now, right? So if I was to take a piece of software and modify it after even it's been notarized, if I modified it and I know how to properly code it, I can get past the Gatekeeper system in notarization, right? So we need to see Apple do more with this, but this is a beginning. This is a true beginning of getting a really decent tool that we can use. All right. Now, when we notarize things, we can notarize several different things. We can notarize Mac apps. We can notarize non-app bundles, such as kernel extensions. So if I write a kernel extension, now it can be notarized, and it becomes part of the protection system. If I look at and say disk image, if I create a disk image, I can notarize it to say, hey, this is certified. I'm proving, you know, this has no malintent on it, right? Or flat installer packages, right? So if I create an installer and it's flat, I can then notarize that and say, you know what, Gatekeeper will see it and say it's been notarized. It checks it and makes sure it's not in the misbehave list, and it works. Now, changes to Gatekeeper, it's non-compulsory right now, right, under Mojave. Under Catalina, I think they've rolled it back a little bit. I think they've stepped back from like the enforcement, and they're trying to roll it out because they see where they've miscued things. But you can guarantee that it's going to be a requirement. And let me show you the command that you actually have to run to notarize something. So if you can see this, I got to run scrun, all tool. I'm going to say I'm notarizing an app. I need the primary bundle ID. And in this example, I'm using right? Your app.app.name, right? So this is whatever you named your app, right? Then I'm establishing a username and an email address, a password that I'm assigning, and that password's not used by anything. That's just made up there, right? And they're saying it's for the file, and I name the DMG that it's going to be part of. I'm notarizing it. So when I notarize that, it puts a lot of information. So if it's been compromised, and Apple has a path to going back. So if they find something in the field that's actually got something bad in it, they know who to come back to. and say, did you do this? Or was it something else that we need to worry about? Right? Now, what's nice about notarization also is it looks at how you're doing things, and if you're making common mistakes, it flags it for you when you run the command. It says, no, you're missing this, or no, you're missing that. You need to fix these things before you can notarize properly. But it builds that database, sends it to Apple, and Gatekeeper has access to that. Now let's get into my favorite. TCC, Transparency, Consent, and Control. How many here are sick and tired of seeing the pop-ups that show up on your computer every time you launch an app for the first time? All right? How many here want it to go away? Shame on you. You can make it go away, right? But it's there for a reason, right? And under Mojave, it was kind of preparing you for what was going to come in Catalina. So it wanted to warn you about certain things. Now, you know, as a Jamf administrator, and I'll pick on Jamf because I'm trained as a Jamf admin, it's not the only MDM out there, right? But I'm going to go from my experience, so I'm going to share that with you. In Jamf, I'm actually able to create a system where I say, you know what? These are whitelisted. These apps are whitelisted. Don't bother telling my users, you know, that, are you sure you want to run this for the first time? So I suppress that. But we made a decision when we first got the first real builds of Catalina that weren't in development, that weren't betas, and we said, all right, this is shipping now. We said, you know what? We need to turn that whitelist off. We need all the users to see the truth. We need to see, we need to hear the feedback from them because we can't know every app that's out in the field. As much as we want to, as admins, say, I know every app that's on my network. Ha, right. I don't, because I'm not there when they install things sometimes. Now, even though I don't give them admin rights, things still find their way onto my machines. I'm always amazed when I look at it and go, how the hell did you get that on there? Right? And I have to look at it and say, who helped you? And then I got to go talk to that IT person and go, what made you think this was a good idea? Right? It's education. So we need to understand when we look at transparency, consent, and control, right, that this tool is really important in the arsenal that we have about protecting the environment. We need to be aware of what's going on, and we need to understand that when this, in Catalina, when it asks for additional levels of access, what it's really going after. How many here actually use OneDrive or Google Drive or Dropbox, right? It's pretty standard across the environment, right? It's a tool that we all rely on. Well, when you launch that under Catalina, you're going to get a warning. And the first thing it's going to warn you is like, hey, this isn't up to snuff if it's still running an old version, like it won't run it. Or then it's going to ask you, do you really want this to have access to different parts of the hard drive? And if you don't answer yes, what happens? It's blocked. Now, here's my problem with that. It requires no administrative privileges. So if I launch an app and it says, can I have access to further areas of your hard drive? And I say yes, and even though I don't give you admin rights, you just compromise the machine if you don't know what you just said yes to. Think about that. Because if I'm payloading in something and I tell you, you need this app, you know, you go to a website that I've crafted and I say, you know what, you can't run this until you get this piece of software that's critical for you. You go, oh, install. I get it installed, and the first time I launch it, it says, can I have control of your hard drive? Well, as an administrator, I'd go, why do you need control? Why do you need that access? Right? I'm trained. I'm suspicious by nature, right? My job. For users, it becomes, oh, sure. And there's the problem, right? It's socially engineered in such a way that it can actually compromise a computer without people really realizing it. That's important to recognize, right? The whole issue, and if you've ever worked on Windows, and back in the early days when we got through, you know, what was right after XP? Vista. What was the wonderful thing about Vista? You had to authorize both incoming and outgoing information. So what happened? You got user fatigue. Everybody was like, yeah, just do it, right? It didn't matter if it was like, this virus, which wants to take over your system, needs access. Yeah, so just do it, right? This is my fear with TCC, right? You end up getting this really user fatigue and they don't understand. And you know what? Nor should they have to. That's our job. Our job is to be the person that protects them. Right? Now, if you're an individual consultant, you need to inform your users, like, be aware of these problems. We need to, we can build white lists that says, you know what, these are trusted apps. They're just going to go right through, no problem. But for those that are not trusted, that are not in that list, we want you to get flagged. And really, you know what, if you're not sure, send me a message. Tell me you're seeing this because I want to talk to you. That's strictly what we really want. Right? So you want to make sure that you're not suppressing all the access control information, but you want to make sure you're also trying to minimize the damage from them getting prompted all the time for everything. Now, here's an example of, I actually opened up Terminal, and I said, all right, I've got admin rights. I'm going to create a cron tab. So I created a cron tab, and the first thing I did when I went to execute is that popped up. And I went, excellent. And I went, no. Guess what happens to that cron tab? Can't run. All right? Now let me take you to the other side of that. How many here actually use video conferencing software? Your clients use it all the time, right? If they don't answer yes to the prompt when it says, Zoom would like access to your microphone and your camera, and they don't say yes to that, what happens? They have a glorified chat client. You're paying a lot of money for something that can't do anything anymore, right? And depending on what beta I was on, that was a nightmare to deal with, right? So I'm really curious to see, as each shipping version comes up, what happens? Can I go back afterwards and say, yeah, we need to authorize this, right? So one of the things, I had to come to grips with was I use Wacom tablets. They're drawing tablets, right? So all the designers, they draw on these screens. They're really interesting devices. We put Mojave out, and the first thing they ran into is like my pen stopped working. I can see that it's actually registering on the screen, but I can't calibrate. I can't do anything with it. And it took me I'll be honest, it took me a couple hours to like, what is going on? Until I found out that it actually had 2 prompts that had to be authorized. And I went, you bastards. All right. And it, rightly so, it needed to be authorized because it was asking for a level of access to run the pen that it never had to before. So it's like, okay, this is new. So this is what my challenge is to you. You really need to understand the tools you use in your environment. What access do they really need? I can sit here and give you my examples, but that's not sufficient for you guys because they don't run what you have. You need to really dive in and say, all right, I'm going to run Catalina. I'm going to put a piece of hardware on there and say, what is the security policy doing when I plug it in? Is it something I need to suppress because I can pre-authorize it and say it's good to go? Or do I need to actually maybe build some education out and say, you know what, when you see this, you need to answer yes to this. But it's this app only. Okay? Now, what about Safari? So what's interesting about Safari under Catalina is if you go to download something in Safari now, and you never used that location before, you're going to get that prompt and say, are you wanting to authorize downloads from this location? That's a wonderful thing. But again, it's a user fatigue issue, right? You need to really look at it and say, you know what, you probably want to build in the approvals for the sites internally on your network so they don't have to deal with that. And you want them to say, you know what, if you get prompted for an area that you've never used before, you need to let IT know, so we need to look at it and validate it, right? It's another layer of security, But it's important because if that site is full of malware, I don't want it downloading anything to the machine. Irregardless of whether I get malware bytes or virus protection software on the machine, those tools are wonderful, but they're not perfect. Right? I want to do everything I can to prevent the machine from being compromised. Right? So when we look at it, you can see, I made it interesting here, so you can see, these are some of the sites that I go to, right? This one, Rich, I know Rich. I've talked to him several times. I have a lot of respect for the guy. He's amazing, right? A lot of us in the old ACN program are still inside MacTech. We lean on each other all the time, right? And that's what's good about this community. When you're here and you're seeing us, we rely on you just as much as we rely on each other, right? Because we can't know everything. If I sit here and say, you know what, there's nothing I can learn from you, I am so full of crap, you need to walk out now, right? Because I bet you there's something I can learn from every one of you, right? And it's important to recognize, right? You're never the smartest guy in the room, except for maybe Ben back there. Oh, yeah, I called you up, Ben. All right. Several, yes, all right. He could just make it magically seem better, all right? All right, so this is really important. So when we're looking at these things, we need to recognize, again, the impact on the enterprise for security. We need to see this and recognize that, all right? So here's a couple quick notes. I didn't put it on the slides, but I want you to be aware of, right? Scripting languages. How many here people work with Python? What version of Python are you using? 2.7, which is ships with the machine? Yeah, please stop. Right? Go to Python 3. So Apple's warning us that in the future versions of the OS, they're not going to ship any scripting languages. So if you're building scripts and you're expecting a scripting language to be on the machine, you might have to build it as a runtime environment. Or be aware that you're going to have to install these things as part of your administration of the system. And what is the impact from security on that machine? Same thing about what shell do you use? How many here live in Bash? Say bye-bye. Say bye-bye, and for good reason, right? Bash is a great shell, but the default is going to be Z shell. Now, it doesn't mean you can't run back to Bash, but once you get used to running with Z shell and all its enhancements that it can do, you'll see why the Apple engineers decided to move to Z shell, right? It takes a little getting used to, right? But some of the tools that it brings to the table are worth it, all right? Activation lock. How many people here are running Apple laptops with the T2 chip? Do you know what the T2 chip is? I should actually make the assumption that nobody understands that. So that T2 chip is what makes File Vault encrypt immediately. So if you're running a pre-T2 chip system, when you turn on File Vault, it actually runs through and says, I'm encrypting your hard drive. And it takes time. Depending on how much data you get, it can take a long time. With T2, it's almost instantaneous. Right? Because the truth is the SSD drive is already encrypted. So it's just adding another layer of protection. Right? Well, with Catalina, you're getting a new thing you can get that we've had with the iPads, and that is activation lock. So I can say that, I can wipe a machine, I can lock a machine. Now you say, well, the MDM can do that now. Yeah, but now it can be done by the user. And the problem is, if you're running an MDM and the user has the ability to assign their Apple ID as the source and control of that machine, you can be locked out of it, right? And that scares the living hell out of me, to be honest with you. Because if I get a disgruntled worker and they bricked my computer, I can't give it out anymore, right? I got a $3,000, $4,000 paperweight, right? So Apple, has thought of that, and they just wrote a new paper about it, and it just came out on the 7th. And that's the link to it. All right? I suggest you all read it. Because if you're dealing with deployment of any type of fleet of equipment, you need to understand what you should suppress and what you can allow. This is really important. Okay? The last thing I want to pick on and show is one of the enhancements I like about Safari from a security standpoint. If you try to create a password for a website with Safari, it'll annoy the hell out of you. It's like, what do you mean password 1234 is not sufficient? Right? That's what I use for everything else. Why should I be any different? Right? No, I do not use that. All right? So it'll actually warn you had a weak password. And it'll keep prompting you until you come up with a better one. And that's really important to recognize. And with the keychain integration, it really helps. One of the things that I do for my users that they're not aware of, because we don't allow password managers, I introduce to them what keychain really can do for you. I show them how to use it, right? Because they're so, like, I can't remember this, so they all use weak passwords, or they use the password over and over and over again. I'm like, no. Use keychain. I show them how to look up what their password for that site is if they don't remember it, right? When I show that to people, they're like, I didn't know we could do that. It's like, yeah, well, because, we're not maybe allowing for the password fill from the keychain, but I can guarantee you that your keychain knows that password. Right? All right. And you could also manually update it. It's not like I can only go to that site and do it. I can actually open up keychain and say, this password, I'm going to change it to this, and it reflects that change. All right. So I did incorporate some resources for you. These are actually right from Apple's developer site. If you really want to dive in and learn more about notarization, there's a bunch of stuff here, including advances in macOS security. This is what I did when I went through and I attended the developer conference remotely. I've been very fortunate in the last 5 years. I've gone to the developer conference 4 years, 3 years in a row. I didn't make the cut this past year. I was disappointed, but I kind of understand it's a lottery system, right? But I was still able to see the same thing and get all the same information. I'm sharing that with you. If you don't have a developer account, I really encourage you to get one. Whether you know how to code or not, there are some resources there that are just well worth it. All right. Oh, you're going to get the slides. You're going to get the slides. Yeah. I'm surprised that it hasn't been like the theme for this whole conference. Is like, do you get the slides? Yeah, you do get the slides. Yeah, you do. It's an old joke for all of us who've been doing MacTech for a while. Do we get the slides? Yes, you get the slides. Guess what? We've made it to the end of my discussion. I'm going to take a few minutes, open it up for any questions you want. I can't promise you I can answer your questions. I'll do my best. Sure.
So we just got audited by the federal government.
I'm sorry.
And so I know. So we're having to script a whole bunch of things. We're going to try and push them out through AirWatch, but now we've got Catalina coming out, and all the users are pushing upgrade.
Yeah.
So is that Gatekeeper gonna block any
Yeah.
special script?
So the question is, if you don't want to allow Catalina yet, you want to get all your security policies in place that the federal government's telling you, then test it against Catalina. So you need to put a mechanism in place to suppress the ability to upgrade to Catalina. You do not want to find out all the work you just did is for naught. Right? And I understand that, right? That's because that's one of the things I have to do is I have to look at and say, this script I wrote 5 years ago, does it still work the same way? Or should I even use it anymore? Right? As an architect for the MIT, when I put the first Mac environment at the Broad Institute, I look at and I go back there every once in a while, and I look at the admin that's there now, and they're like, your fingerprints are all over this thing. It's like, of course it is. I architected it. But that doesn't mean you don't change it all, right? The decisions I made 7, 8, 9 years ago are not necessarily still a true thing today. You need to grow and see how things change. That's why I didn't try to go into too much level in to this talk, I wanted you to see you really need to dig in. I can point you at and say, hey, you need to be aware of these things, but now you got to dig in because it affects how you work in your environment. All right. Yeah.
Should I stop paying for AMP for endpoints? Because it does not work at all in Catalina.
I think you just answered your own
Are we
question.
secure enough in Catalina that we can forget AMP?
So define what AMP does for you. Okay, so I just needed to make sure I understood what the question was. No. No. All right? Because again, there are tools and there are things in their place, but again, without those extra layers, you really need to understand something. You know, this is a point I made a long time ago. I actually took a seminar class at Apple a long time ago, and we talked about what's the most secure computer on the planet. If I created a system that was that secure, what would be the first thing I could tell you that you couldn't do to it? You couldn't log in. Nor could you have access to it because it'd be buried under concrete. Right? It's not usable. Right? So security is all about creating usability with protections, and layering is the name of the game. If those of you who are network engineers and understand firewalls, right? Firewalls are all about layers, putting the protection in layers. You want to make sure that you don't create a rule that steps on all the other rules, right? I've heard in several of the sessions I've been in is, you know, any. It's like when you see that rule, that trumps everything. It's like you've got any in a firewall rule, every other rule you have means nothing, right? So you need to make sure you understand the scope of what you're protecting for. Any other questions? It depends on what it's trying to reach down into. So I don't know what you're coding for. Yeah, no, but specifically, is it dealing with a hardware kernel extension? Is it dealing with something that's in the operating system that's now locked and read-only, right? It's going to look at it and say, you know what? I need to pay attention to this, and is it signed? Is it notarized? If it's not, it's going to get flagged, right? And so you need to be aware of that. So again, that's why I really encourage you, if you're going to do administration, go get an admin, go get a developer account, because you're going to learn a lot more about the nitty-gritty of protecting the operating system.
How do you do that?
Go to the developer, go to Apple's website, and just search for developer, and it's $99. Yeah. You know, and I remember when it was, I had one for macOS, I had one for iOS, and they were big money, you know. And I look at them now and I go, it's $99 for both? That's a no-brainer for me, right? I'll pay for that out of my own pocket, right? Because that's how much I value that information. And the fact that I get access to stuff that I normally wouldn't get access to. Yes.
You know, if
Go ahead.
if you're on like dev Twitter, if you're on info Twitter, tech Twitter, when a Catalina, when a Mojave, when these .0 releases come out, there's often big companies bragging about, 3,700 users adopted on one day. You know, how many, look at what our MDM is doing, look at how awesome we are. Based on your experiences with beta, is that a good thing in your eyes, bragging about this onboarding on day one, or is it really, should we be waiting?
Point, right? And it all depends on, in a canned environment where you control everything, and you've been able to beta test and know that I'm only running Office. So I can deploy and say Catalina is good to go on day one because I've already validated that it's okay with Office 365. So if I get 3,700 users that are upgrading, I'm not worried about it because I've already validated. I work in a creative room, a creative world. I got multiple sites across the globe. We make them wait 6 months, right? The only exception to that is when the hardware gets it before we are able to say we're releasing it, we have to kind of deal with it, right? But, you know, it's not that long ago that we just released Mojave, right? And the only people who got Mojave were hardware that was new, they got Mojave. Now, let's understand something that's really important. Back in the old days when we had monolithic images and we did all this, we would look at it and say, you know what? I need to make sure everything is bulletproof in that image and it's good to go. We don't do that anymore. We do everything as payloads. We don't even touch the operating system anymore. We payload into it, right? So it's a little easier. So if I get a new machine, I still apply all the same policies to it. I just see what it breaks, right? That's the real difference. And that's the real value of being on early builds, okay? One more question, then we're going to call it. Yes, sir.
My question was clarification. You said that when you have stopped waitlisting because you want the users to experience?
I need to see everything. So we used to suppress everything. Say, I don't want anybody to see that dialog box at all. We actually have turned that off because we want them to see it and we want to find out what the feedback is. Again, because we don't know every app.
So they're voluntarily providing you feedback?
Yes, yes. So, and there's an interesting thing is, you know, if you want to know what apps are running 32-bit versus 64-bit, there's a couple ways to do it. If you reach out to me and say, can I have the script you wrote? I will gladly send it to you. And it actually creates a report that the users can send back to you. And you can see what's on their system that's non-compliant. No, it actually runs in Bash. It actually runs in Bash. All right? It's not a real complicated script, but it's really effective. You know, I basically go through and say, capture the machine name and list all the 32-bit apps. Right? And because I was surprised myself, right? Because I've been working with Adobe for a long time, and it's been running on Catalina, and yet there are still pieces of Adobe that are 32-bit. And I went, ooh, they're just features I don't use. Then I went, see? There was value in finding out what's 32-bit on the system, including I found a few Apple things. That really shocked me, right? It's like, but I'm working in early betas, so it's like, okay. So I want to thank everyone. Again, my name is Leon. Last name is Lincoln. You can reach me on Twitter at LLincoln3, right? You can, you know, look at my bio on the page. I am more than happy to take questions, and you can reach out to me. I do respond. I just may be a delay because I do travel the globe. So the different time zones I'm in. Him I just ignore. That's fine.